And welcome to today's live stream presentation, Nourishing Wellbeing, the role of nutrition in caregiving. My name is Melissa Favela, and I am the community educator for Southern Caregiver Resource Center, where our mission is caring for those who care for others. I'm very excited to be with you here today. So if you want to grab a notepad, a pen, take some notes down, now's the time. So without further ado, let's get started with today's presentation. Next slide, please. Perfect. So let's start with our learning objectives. Today we will be talking about why nutrition matters, right? Why is it important to discuss nutrition, not just for the care receiver, but also for the caregiver? Also to talk about the risk of malnutrition. It's a real risk for, again, both the caregiver and the care receiver. We'll also be talking about some general nutrition tips and some food safety recommendation that we should take into consideration. And then we'll also be talking about mealtime considerations, again, for both the caregiver and the care receiver. Next slide, please. So again, we're going to start with why nutrition matters, right? Why are we talking about it? Well, nutrition is a public health issue across different community providers, whether it be individual practitioners to community clinics and hospitals. They're realizing that treating food insecurity and poor nutrition as a health issue can lead to better health outcomes in communities and also reduce healthcare costs in the long run. So nutrition is definitely a key factor for quality of life, and it is encouraged to pay attention to our nutrition throughout our lifespan so that in older age, we hopefully have a better quality of life and just a better well-being overall. Nutrition also matters because financial strain is a reality, right? We know that we need to budget for our groceries. Some people qualify for food assistance programs, others do not. So making sure that we're consuming the right nutrition for each individual can be a challenge, and financial strain is a reality. So we should also be talking about it for that reason. Also, because we're talking caregivers here, a healthy caregiver is more likely to be a better caregiver, right? If caregivers are looking at what they're supposed to be eating or what they should be eating as an individual, if they're consuming nutrient-dense meals that are giving them energy, then yes, they'll have the energy to be a caregiver that is, looking after their care receiver, whatever that may look like. It's different for everyone. But again, nutrition is the key part of our lives. And then finally, nutrition matters because malnutrition is a big risk. It's a big risk, not just for the care receiver, but also for the caregiver. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next slides. So next slide, please. Thank you. Now we're going to talk about the factors that affect the nutrition status for the care receiver. So right here we have a diagram from Abbott Nutrition Health Institute, and it lists 4 different factors that can affect the nutrition status in the aging process, right? So number 1 is mental health. Number 2 is economic health. Number 3 is emotional health. And number 4 is physical health. So let's go through each one of them. When we're talking about care receiver and we're talking about mental health, that can mean a lot of things. But a few examples would be, let's say that our care receiver is starting to have memory loss, show signs of confusion or dementia. That can lead, let's say, for them to forget that they haven't eaten, right? Maybe they start reducing the amount of meals that they have in a day. So that's an example, a simple example of how mental health issues or mental health can affect the nutrition status of that care receiver. Number two is economic health, right? So let's say our care receiver still needs to budget for their groceries, right? Even though they might have a caregiver. So maybe they're living with limited income. Maybe they're living in poverty or near poverty. Maybe they have food insecurity in different levels. Or maybe even they're having trouble finding transportation, someone to take them to the store, let's say. So, of course, this is going to limit the amount, and not just the amount, but also the quality of the foods that the care receiver is acquiring or consuming. Then we have emotional health. So, when we eat, traditionally, it can be a social interaction, right? Eating can be a social part of our lives. We go out to eat with friends, family, or we invite people to eat at our homes. But let's say in the case of care receivers, maybe they're living alone. Maybe, they don't have a lot of interactions with friends or family. So that can definitely lead to isolation, loneliness, depression. And again, a lot of care receivers may start saying like, well, I'm not really hungry. What's the point of me eating by myself? So that can also affect the nutrition status of care receivers. And then number four is probably the most talked about, the most popular one, if you will. It's physical health. So physical health means it's a lot of aspects that we can look at, right? But it could be, for example, changes in their senses, right? A reduced sense of smell, a reduced sense of taste, maybe. So that can cause for them to maybe start eating less, or as an example, maybe start adding more, let's say, seasonings, more salt to their food because they can't taste it, right? So this can obviously affect their nutrition status as well. Some people are also struggling with dental issues, right? They have poor dentition. So maybe we need to look at, can they actually chew the food that they're consuming? Do we need to change to softer textures? So those are things that can affect nutrition status. And finally, again, just to add another example here, would be, let's say, what if they are dealing with other chronic conditions? Let's say they're going through cancer treatment, or they have to take care of their nutrition because they have diabetes. So of course, physical health is going to affect their nutrition status. Now, if one of these starts being affected, or more than one, then of course the nutrition status of that care receiver is going to be reduced. And that's not something that we want. And of course, this can happen to anyone, but we are focusing right now on the care receiver. Next slide, please. So all of these issues can lead to malnutrition. Now, the World Health Organization describes malnutrition as when the body does not have the right balance of calories or nutrients to be able to stay healthy, to function properly. So this is a clinical term. And when we think about who's at risk for malnutrition, the National Institute on Aging states that up to 50% of older adults, meaning 65 and older, are at a risk of malnutrition. So that's 50% of the population of 65 plus. And when we think about that, by 2030, the 65 plus population will be doubled. Then this is a big number. This is a big risk for malnutrition for our care receivers. And even some caregivers might be in this range of population as well. So why is malnutrition something that we should be talking about, tackling? Well, because it can complicate pre-existing conditions. That can lead to medical complications. It could lead to longer hospital stays, and of course, financial strain. And then at the very end, a lower quality of life. Next slide, please. So we already talked about the causes of malnutrition a little bit, but again, the causes are the body's inability to digest or use nutrients effectively, or an inadequate diet. right? So that's the gist of what's happening in the body. Now, of course, now we know that there are physical, social, psychological issues that can also be causes for malnutrition. And of course, these can lead to loss of appetite. It may be due to depression or another condition, or for example, medications, or just the inability to, as simple as to get groceries from the store, right? So those are some of the causes. Next slide, please. So malnutrition, unfortunately, can go undetected for a long time. And again, malnutrition isn't just for the care receiver, but it can also happen with the caregiver. For example, people think that malnutrition is only weight loss. Well, yes, it is a sign of malnutrition, but it could also be the opposite, right? So what we're talking about is inadequate nutrient intake, inadequate calories that prevent the body from functioning properly. So it can develop over time, but we do need to be aware of the most common signs, and those would be weight loss, swelling of the abdomen, legs, ankles, feet. Also, a decrease in appetite, a decrease in the amount of food consumed. And of course, this would lead to a decrease in bowel habits and ultimately a decrease in energy. So the activity level goes down significantly. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about nutrition, not just as an individual thing, but as a caregiving responsibility. Okay, so providing care and support for a caregiver really brings a variety and sometimes overwhelming responsibilities. And of course, we think of food or eating as something that we do as a routine, right? Hopefully we all eat on a daily basis. We all have nutritional needs. So in a way, it's normalized. But for caregivers, this is a little different. Let's say if someone's caring for someone who has dementia, well, the feeding times, the meals may pose different challenges from day to day, from meal to meal. So really, it depends on what the condition is, and just care nutrition as a caregiving responsibility. So there was a study done from the California Resource Centers along with UC Davis Health that found that in California, about 90.4% of caregivers provide high level of care. Those can be a lot of things, but within that high level of care pertaining to nutrition, it includes tube feeding. So imagine family caregivers taking on high levels of care like tube feeding with very little or no instruction. We're talking major caregiving responsibilities here. Also, the Caregiver Nutrition Education Toolkit states that out of the caregiver responsibilities that are related to meal and meal preparation, about 76% of the caregivers do the grocery shopping or provide other shopping assistance to their care receivers, and 61% of caregivers are part of the meal preparation. So again, more than half. These are major numbers that we're seeing. So of course, nutrition is a big part of the caregiving responsibility. Next slide, please. So now let's shift our focus, not just for the care receiver, but also for the caregiver, right? So why is nutrition important for the caregiver? Well, because of all the other reasons we talked about for the care receiver, but also because as individuals, as people, as caregivers, we also need to have our nutritional needs met, right? And that's again something that's individual to each and every one of us. We may have medical diagnoses that require attention to our nutrition. We may be dealing with diabetes. We may be dealing with heart conditions. So it's not just always the nutrition of the people that we care for, but also ourselves. And the same study, the study from UC Davis Health and the California Resource Centers, found that 1/3 of all caregivers feel highly strained and overwhelmed and are at a higher risk for deteriorating health. And of course, nutrition fits into this, right? So that is why it's also important to watch out for nutrition as a caregiver. Next slide, please. So now we're gonna move on to those general tips and recommendations in terms of nutrition. Now, I want to introduce you, if you're not familiar with them, we have the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. We also shorten them as the DGAs, but basically these are guidelines that are established by the federal government every 5 years. So the guidelines that you are seeing on screen are the guidelines that pertain to the timeline of 2015 to 2020. So next year in 2025, we will be very excited because these dietary guidelines for Americans will be updated or modified in whatever way they found it relevant to address the overall American population's nutritional status. So let's get on to what these guidelines are. So the first recommendation is to follow a healthy eating pattern across the lifespan. And we had mentioned this earlier, right? That's why nutrition is considered a public health issue, because when we address our eating patterns throughout our life, then in older age, we may have better health outcomes. So yes, we want to do this. Of course, sometimes it's easier said than done, but this is something that all Americans should strive for. The second recommendation is to focus on variety, nutrient density, and amount. So I love this recommendation because the first thing in there is not amount, right? Usually that's the first thing when we think nutrition, we want to limit ourselves. But what they're really telling us is that, hey, let's eat from a variety of food groups. Don't just eat one food group, two food groups. Eat a variety of food groups. Make sure that the foods that you are consuming are nutrient dense. What that means is that they're actually giving you nutrients, right? That they're giving you vitamins, that they're giving you macronutrients, right? That we're looking at quality over quantity. So this is something that is lovely to see. The third recommendation is to limit calories from added sugars and saturated fats, as well as to reduce sodium intake. So this is, again, same thing. We want to make sure that the let's say the foods that we're consuming aren't that high in added sugars, that they're not that high in saturated fats, that they're not that high in sodium. So it kind of blends in together with recommendation number 2, right? And then recommendation number 4 is to shift to healthier food and beverage choices. What this recommendation is saying is that it's acknowledging that maybe not everybody has the ability to eat nutrient-dense foods all of the time, every day, right? But it is saying, well, maybe there's a healthier option out there that you maybe aren't thinking of, that still might be simple, that might be accessible, right? That it's not an extra financial strain. So just making sure that we're shifting to that healthier food or beverage choice. So it's giving us some flexibility. And then the final recommendation is to support healthy eating patterns for all. So again, this also ties in with that first recommendation. And this is because we are not only looking to be healthy when we're young, when we're kids, or in our early adult years, but really we want a healthy pattern for all and throughout our lifespan. So these are great recommendations that are recommended by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide, please. So moving on, these lists of nutrients that you see here are nutrients of interest for older adults. Now, remember, older adults, we're talking 65 and older. So this is not just for care receivers. This might also be for caregivers that are in that age group. So nutrients of interest would be protein, making sure that we're consuming enough, that we're consuming it in several meals throughout our day. How much? Well, that requires you to check in with your doctor, and we'll talk about that a little bit further on. To consume fiber. Fiber is the nutrient that it has been known that in the American diet, fiber is not a big priority. In American diet is not as present. So it is a nutrient of interest that we want to consume, that we want to pay attention to. And we'll talk about fiber in a little bit on in the next couple of slides. Also calcium, right? Calcium, we've all heard of it. We all know of the benefits, but this is a nutrient of interest for older adults. And then the following vitamins: vitamin B12, B6, vitamin D. And again, we will talk a little bit more about these nutrients in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. All right, so here we have some general nutrition tips. Again, not just for the care receivers, but also for the caregivers. So first one there, water, right? We want to make sure that we are drinking several glasses of water per day. If you don't know what is appropriate for you, again, make sure to check in with your primary care provider. But making sure that the drink that we drink the most is water. This is maybe an area where if you're saying, well, I have more of a sweet tooth, I do drink sugar sweetened beverages. Well, see if you can drink one more glass of water per day, right? We can start small, but again, focusing on water intake. Our second recommendation would be maintain ideal body weight. So again, this is one of the things where it's sometimes easier said than done, but there are some recommendations that can help us look at maintaining our body weight in a maybe more holistic way. For example, making sure that we're including different colors in our food. So if you look at your plate and if you only have two colors, well, maybe we're lacking some nutrients. But let's say you have 5 different colors in your plate. That is it must look lovely. It's going to be more appealing, right? And sometimes we eat with our eyes, as they say, and you'll have a good variety of nutrients. So maybe paying attention to the colors that you're consuming, and you can do this by including more fruits, more vegetables, right? Those tend to be very colorful, and also making sure that we're consuming good sources of whole grains. This is maybe where we're going to get some of that fiber as well. Also, this goes along with the dietary guidelines for Americans, making sure that we're limiting those saturated fats and those foods that are high in added sugars. Now, saturated fats can be a little bit easier to identify because they tend to be solid at room temperature. So think of butter, okay? Now, the third recommendation would be to include plenty of fiber in your diet. So we're mentioning fiber over and over. This is not an accident. Fiber is very important, and we can get fiber via fruits, vegetables with their skin on, whole grains, legumes, nuts. And again, if you're wondering how much fiber should I consume, again, this is something where you discuss one-on-one with your provider. Next slide, please. All right, again, we see the fats, right? Fats are something that we definitely want to watch out for. It's important to say that not all fats are bad. Fats are not bad. It's more of the types of fats that we consume and the quality. So again, instead of thinking that all fats are bad, maybe we can start by saying, all right, I'm going to start choosing leaner cuts of meat. Maybe I'm going to eat fish a little bit more. Maybe, I'm going to favor chicken a little bit more. Also, dairy products, right? If you consume milk, cheese, yogurt, well, maybe consuming lower fat dairy products can also limit those saturated fats. If we're a fan of salads and we have salad dressings, well, again, using them sparingly, making sure that we're not basically inundating our salad with salad dressing. And then some other recommendations would be, for example, reducing added fats when we're cooking. That way the food is a little bit leaner. Or for example, even cooking with different methods that don't require added fats, right? So again, a lot of options, and we can see what works best for caregivers, for care receivers. The other recommendation would be to watch the salt in foods, maybe instead potassium-rich foods, but really it's more about watching the sodium, right? So for example, if we're seasoning our meals, maybe using sodium-free herbs, sodium-free spices. If we do add salt to our meals, well, maybe adding it in the process of cooking and not after we have our plate in front of us or the care receiver has their plate in front of them, because really that's where we can go overboard with the salt. And then looking for the word sodium, right? Looking for the word sodium in the nutrition label, if that's something that we're looking at, if that's something that we're working on to help reduce our sodium intake. Next slide, please. All right, and here we see, again, we mentioned vitamin B12, vitamin B6 a couple of slides ago. So vitamin B12 is found in animal products, right? So it'll be in dairy, it'll be in meats, so really a variety of foods. There are also some non-animal foods that are fortified with vitamin B12, so that can also be an option. And B12 is important for, again, older folk, because the ability to absorb B12 in the body reduces as we age. So again, if you're not sure about B12, make sure that you talk to your primary care provider. And then we have vitamin B6. So vitamin B6 is one of those that has been studied that may help prevent memory decline, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be magical, that if we have B6 in our meals, we're never going to have memory decline. No, it is something that might help though. So we do want to pay attention to it, or if we're caring for someone who's at risk for vitamin B6 deficiency, they're 65 and older, because the ability to absorb declines with age, well, maybe again, that's something that we should talk to their medical provider about. And vitamin B6, again, it's found in a variety of foods, right? In beans, chicken, bananas, baked potato, pork, fish, nuts, and fortified breakfast cereals. So again, we have a lovely variety of foods that contain these nutrients to make sure that our meals and the care receivers' meals are still interesting. Next slide, please. Now, along with all the nutrition, right, we want to make sure that we are looking at our overall health, right? So that includes our bones, right? So we want to make sure that we're consuming calcium-rich foods or foods that are fortified with calcium, right? So the most popular ones tend to be dairy products, but there are other sources. But again, just making sure that we're seeing that calcium intake somewhere. Also, exercising, right? This complements nutrition, and you'll hear it from your providers, from your care receiver providers, movement, exercise. And really, it's never too late to either rebuild muscle or maintain your muscle, but we do need to practice weight-bearing exercises, right? And also make sure that we're including some type of daily activity. Again, we're kind of giving ourselves the opportunity to think outside the box. Exercise is not just running or going to the gym and doing weights, right? What is appealing to you? What might help you stay in your movement routine? Thinking of exercise as something more maybe fun if you're not a fan right now. So making sure that for caregivers, we have some movements, and for care receivers, right? Depending on their condition, depending on their state, well, we might have to, again, discuss with medical professionals what type of movement they're able to do. So again, it really is individualized, but it's something to think about and discuss with the care team. And if possible, making eating a social event. We talked about this earlier on, how the prevention of isolation during meal times is part of the nutrition status, right? So if we try to get together with friends or family or neighbors, with our care receiver, or we bring the care receiver to our home, or as a caregiver, if you need a moment to go out to have dinner with friends, excellent. Trying to make some meals a social event, right? And then, of course, very important, keeping food safe. And we'll build on that in the next slide, please. So, food safety. Food safety is a very big part of our nutrition, a very big part of our overall health, because, again, if we are caring for an older adult, 65 or older, they are at a higher risk for hospitalizations related to foodborne illness. They're at an increased risk for several reasons. Our gut health, our digestive system tends to slow down. It holds food in a little bit longer. It may allow bacteria to multiply more. Maybe we are not secreting enough acid, so bacteria doesn't die within the stomach. Also, maybe the liver, the kidneys may not be functioning properly, so they're not able to get rid of toxins. And also, as we age, our immune system also starts being challenged. Maybe it's not as active as it was in the past. So that is also a big part of why older people tend to be more susceptible to foodborne illness. So, what are some simple steps that you can do to maintain that food safety? And not just for the care receiver, but for anybody, right? For anybody. This is very applicable to anyone. So the first thing we want to do is to make sure that we are clean, that our hands are clean, that our work surface is clean, that we're washing our food correctly. But basically, we want to maintain that sanitation. The next thing we would recommend is to make sure that you are separating. What does that mean? Well, that you're separating the raw foods from the already cooked foods, that you're separating maybe like the meats from the vegetables or the fruit. That's where sometimes cross-contamination happens, and that can lead to bacteria, and that can lead to foodborne illness. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to how we're separating our foods, our meals, especially, the cooked with the uncooked. Then that leads us to the cooking process. Sometimes we have really thick, chicken breasts or pieces of meat. And so sometimes when we look at them from the outside, they look cooked, but when we check inside, they might not be completely cooked. So this is also a big part of food safety, that we make sure that we are cooking foods to the correct temperatures. This will kill those possible bacteria, those foodborne pathogens, and that will prevent foodborne illness. And then once the food is cooked, that we're chilling it correctly, right? We don't want to leave, a piece of chicken out the whole afternoon, because that can have bacteria develop and it can make someone very sick. So that we know at least these things. Now, if you're looking for specifics, at the end, I'll give you some recommendations of where to find maybe more specific recommendations if you're interested. But again, as a general recommendation, make sure that we are avoiding foods, or that the older folk that you're caring for are avoiding foods that are undercooked, unpasteurized, that they're raw. For example, like pre-made deli salads, or those cold cuts that sometimes are used in sandwiches. So just being aware of that. Next slide, please. Now, we're here at Mealtime Considerations for care receivers, right? So it really depends on what's going on. But let's say we are caring for someone who has dementia, who has Alzheimer's. Well, of course, we want to make sure to offer them nutrient-dense foods. We may also want to apply some Strategies like make the place settings very neutral, no bright colors. Maybe we're going to use utensils that are designed for dementia patients. We want to make them as comfortable as possible. We want to give them time to eat, right? This can be very challenging. Sometimes caregivers don't really have a lot of time, so maybe working with that, being flexible in the routine. Keeping track of acceptable foods. This is both the foods that are recommended by the care team, let's say their doctor, or if they have a nutrition specialist, but also acceptable foods for the care receiver, right? Another very important point that I want to make here is the caregiver's expectations. Sometimes as a caregiver, I'm gonna, make my care receiver the meal that they used to eat. They're gonna love it. It's gonna be great. But because of their condition, Alzheimer's, dementia, etc., maybe it doesn't go as we planned. Maybe they don't want to eat it at that moment. And so these are expectations that can affect caregivers, right? So being flexible with our expectations, being realistic, letting go of those mealtime expectations can be very freeing for the caregiver, right? And then also we want to make sure that we are aware that as dementia, as Alzheimer's progress, there may be a higher risk for choking. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to those signs or details that might be coming up. Now, when it comes to oral health, well, again, we mentioned it previously, but if there are dentition issues, maybe they can't chew everything properly. Maybe we need softer textures. Maybe we need to thicken liquids so that it's easier to swallow. So making sure that we're also discussing that with the care team to see what is needed. Food and drug interaction. This is very important and something that should be discussed again with the medical providers, with the specialists that the care receiver might have, making sure that the medications that they're taking, this includes vitamins, don't react negatively with some foods, right? And this is real. There are food and drug interactions in some cases, so we want to make sure that we're addressing them. And nutrition support therapy. Again, I mentioned earlier that family caregivers did higher care needs. This includes feeding tube, which is known as enteral nutrition, or intravenous tube, known as parenteral nutrition. So making sure that if this type of nutrition support therapy is needed, well, that we're trained, that we know what to do, that we're taking the necessary precautions, or that we're taking those mealtime considerations. Next slide, please. Now, mealtime considerations for the caregivers. Again, nutrient-dense meals, making sure that we're not just eating to feel full, to stop that hunger, but that we're actually eating nutritious or nutrient-dense meals. I know this is, again, easier said than done. I know this can be challenging. But making sure that if we know that we have a busy week ahead, maybe we have several doctor's appointments related to our care receiver, then maybe that we try to do at least one nutrient-dense meal a day, right? Maybe trying to find that flexibility, maybe asking for help, right? For someone else to do a nutrient-dense meal for us. Also, trying to give ourselves that moment of having a meal that is stress-free. Maybe if we know that we're rushing and we're going to sit down to eat, we're really hungry, maybe we take a few breaths before we actually start eating. We want to be a little bit more intentional when we eat. Or maybe try to practice some exercises of trying to really focus on the flavors of the food, the texture of the food, really focusing on something that might relieve that stress during the meal time, right? And then giving ourselves time. This is really tough because as caregivers, there isn't a lot of time. There is no extra time. There's no, 30-hour day where we give ourselves time. So really, we need to plan to see if there's enough time to do a grocery list or enough time to do a little bit of meal prep one day out of the week, trying to figure out time of our meals, of our snacks. So time is a really big one. It's a big challenge, but again, it's doable. Hopefully it's doable. And then finally, the socializing. I keep bringing socializing up because it's very important. Caregivers are at a higher risk for being isolated, right? I mean, we said that earlier. So making sure that we're socializing, if a mealtime is part of the socializing, well, what better thing, right? So making sure that we are taking that time to socialize. Next slide, please. So, grocery shopping. These are just some tips that we recommend. When we are grocery shopping, ideally we would be planning it ahead of time, right? We want to make sure that we have a list. That way, it saves us time in the long run. We know what meals that we're going to make during the week. So, it also hopefully saves us money in the long run. And don't go when hungry, because when we go when we're hungry, we tend to go towards those snacks, maybe towards those foods that aren't necessarily nutritious, maybe just that we're craving them. And another thing to consider is if you're thinking, well, cooking takes a really long time, I really don't have time, that's why I eat out. That's fair. But maybe also thinking outside the box of what meals can I consume that aren't necessarily too processed, but that they're just easy, right? So this is where foods like fortified cereals come in, right? If you find a fortified cereal, some of them have protein, some of them have fiber, some of them are very low in sugar. And if you're having it with a dairy or a non-dairy milk, it's fortified with calcium, with vitamin D. So I'm mentioning these nutrients of interest that we talked about, and it's cereal, right? So I know I'm not saying to eat cereal every day, but again, just thinking outside the box. Also, for example, soups, right? Maybe if we have a slow cooker or crock pot, we can throw different things in there and then it's done for us, right? Or smoothies, right? Making sure that we have some chopped fruit, some veggies that we can just add to a smoothie. We click the blender and then it's done, right? So again, thinking of different strategies to consume nutrient-dense foods, but that they're also easy. They're not as time-consuming. And then don't be afraid to fill the freezer. Make extra food, chill it correctly, but then save it in the freezer, right? Or also, let's say if vegetables take up a lot of your time, buy frozen fresh vegetables. They go in the freezer, but they're lifesavers, right? So they're saving you time, they're saving you money, and they're adding to your nutrition. Next slide, please. And then helping the caregiver. So some of us may not be caregivers, but we may know a caregiver in our lives, or maybe we were caregivers and we're not anymore. Well, we can always help by maybe helping them plan meals, maybe helping them make the shopping list ahead of time, maybe helping them prepare ingredients ahead of time. For example, if the caregiver wants a smoothie, then maybe we help them clean the fruit and chop it up and put it in the freezer so it's ready to go. Also, maybe just bringing them a thoughtful gift, right? Something they enjoy. Hey, here's a nice, scented lotion for you, something for the caregiver. Maybe if we are cooking, we're not a caregiver, but if we're cooking, maybe we can freeze the leftovers and take it to those busy caregivers. Maybe if we're cooking and we have that hot meal and we can take it right away, we're taking that hot meal to the caregiver. And then, of course, there are a ton of different ways that we can help. So maybe offering help in other areas as well. Next slide, please. All right, so last but not least, just a little bit of resources, some things to take into consideration. I talked throughout the presentation to talk to medical professionals, right? It's very important that when we are talking about nutrition for us, the caregivers or our care receivers, that we are getting that information from professionals, right? So talk to your medical doctor, talk to a registered dietitian, to a nutritionist, because they will be able to give you specific recommendations to your needs in your medical conditions or your care receivers' needs, their medical conditions. So make sure that you're getting that information from professionals. Also, there are online reputable sources. For example, AARP offers an awesome grocery list for older adults. That might give you some ideas. The CDC gives you information on the food safety to avoid foodborne illness. And then we talked about the dietary guidelines for Americans, which you can find on in the My Plate US Department of Agriculture website. And then of course, Southern Caregiver Resource Center, I'll expand on that. And then there are other services that you may qualify, or your care receiver might qualify. There's Meals on Wheels, SNAP, CalFresh. So again, making sure that we know of resources, that we're reaching out in the community to see what's available for us or our care receivers. Next slide, please. And so, talking about Southern Caregiver Resource Center, we offer free classes for family caregivers that focus on caregivers who care for someone who has memory loss, Alzheimer's, dementia. This is our TLC program. It's in English, and it basically provides caregivers with strategies to cope with stress. They learn skills to better manage behaviors, right? And some of those behaviors may be during meal times. Also to prevent isolation, right? We talked about this. So if you're interested, you can contact us in the numbers that you see on screen. Next slide, please. We also have right now an animated toolkit for dementia care in the community. These are 15-minute animated videos that are informational, right? They're called Empowering Caregivers. And it's self-paced, they're animated, and they're there to build confidence and competence as a caregiver. Right? So hopefully this adds to your library of knowledge. You can go online to get started at caregivingtraining.org, or you can give us a call and we can give you more information. This is available until June. Next slide, please. We're also very excited. Something else that we're offering is that if you're a caregiver or you were a caregiver and you have all these skills, right? You like doing it. So maybe you're curious about what it would be like to be a professional caregiver. Well, SCRC has partnered with CNA Simulations to give those caregivers a peek into how home health aides are trained, right? What is that like? So these simulations are a little bit longer, but you basically train, you practice making decisions, and you explore what it is to do these things as a home health aide. So again, you can access these at cnasimvr.com/learn. Or you can give us a call as well. We can give you more information. And again, this is available until June as well. So it's a great opportunity to explore. Next slide, please. And then, of course, SCRC offers all of these wonderful services. We offer pairing up caregivers to a family consultant so that they can have support throughout their caregiving journey. We also have support groups in both English, in Spanish, in person, online. We also offer individual counseling sessions for those caregivers who are more focused on that one-on-one practice. Again, in English, in Spanish, in person, or virtual. We also offer legal and financial consultation, and we have a big department of education and training, right? We have presentations such as these where we can, we have them in person, we have them online. We have employer resources for those employers who may have a lot of caregivers in their staff. Here we also see our TLC and our Calma programs. And we have a library in our offices, which is part of our specialized information. We have a variety of information that caregivers can, just come and access and check out. It's available. We also offer respite and, of course, online resources. Our webpage is a fountain of knowledge and free resources. So Next slide, please. Some of the things that you can find in our iCare portal would be Caregiver Corner, where you can watch quick tip videos on different things caregiving. You can also find our podcast called Let's Talk Caregiving, where, anything caregiver is discussed. They're just candid conversations about caregiving. That podcast is released once a month, and you can find all the previously released episodes on our website. We also have family caregiver classes. So similar to this, the ones that we have aired in the past, you can find them on our website. And then you can also sign up for our digital newsletter called CRC's Wavelengths, where you can find articles, you can find updates, news, and just useful resources in general. Next slide, please. And then finally, you can also follow us on our social networks, right? If, let's say, you already follow us and maybe you know someone who's a caregiver or they might be interested in our services, then, tell them what our Instagram is, right? Maybe they can find us on Facebook. So you can connect with us through Facebook, through Instagram, through LinkedIn, right? YouTube, maybe you're watching us today via YouTube, maybe you're watching us today via Facebook. And like I mentioned, we also have our podcast. And also to mention, we have an Instagram live as well every month, and that is in Spanish, where we talk one-on-one with caregivers, right? So we have a variety of ways where caregivers can access free information. Next slide, please. And last but not least, here is our information. This is our website, www.caregivercenter.org. You can also give us a call at our toll-free number, which is 800-827-1008, or our regular line, 858-268-4432. We will answer you Monday through Friday, 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. If you get an answering machine, no worries. Leave a message. We will call you back. Okay, so make sure that you reach out to us. We are here to help you. We are here to offer these wonderful resources. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope this was helpful. Have a great rest of your day.